Good afternoon, comrades. Henry and Dinga, are you back?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, we're going to start now, if that's fine.
Okay.
So, okay, good afternoon, comrades, and welcome to the second episode of Chisimani Center for Activist Education's video series on migration and borders. The title of this episode is Migration and Labor: What Early Trade Unions in South Africa Teach Us About Solidarity and Internationalism. In our first episode of this series, we looked at the current situation regarding what's happening at our borders. A picture was painted of increasing state militarization, repression, and unsubstantiated claims of migrants stealing jobs and being criminal. All of this was interrogated. The South African working class in many ways is framed to be in competition for services, employment, and space with migrants, which has implications for the working class and the organizing groups around it, in particular, the labor sector. So this issue of labor is quite important to this discussion about migration, obviously, and the borders. The reason this episode is framed as a journey to the past, at history though, is because as many veterans and activists and elders like to remind us, especially younger activists, this struggle is old. and much of it, what is being experienced now, has played out in the past. This is why, in particular, we're looking at a very important trade union of the 1920s, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union of South Africa, the ICU. They tussled with a number of issues and important issues, but in particular, they represented quite a notable mandate on immigration, worker unity, and internationalism. Presenting to us today is Henry D. And Dinga Sekwebu. Henry and Dinga, if you want to put on your video, that would be great. Henry will be taking us on a journey to the 1920s, contextualizing this time and filling us in on the contestations and complexities within the ICU and the related movements of the time. Comrade Dinga will assist us with making sense of what we might learn from this period and in reflecting on this current moment. But I'll introduce them formally after this. I first want to show you a short video. This video was made in 2019, commemorating the 100 years of the ICU. It was done in Makanda at a conference. So if you give me some of your time, I'm just going to play this video if my laptop can assist. Okay, here we go.
Okay, so what can the modern left learn from the ICU? Well, I think first of all, it's like really important. It always engages with like bread and butter issues.
More than once, the ICU leaders would say that economic, material improvements in the lives of their members mattered more than the vote. They would say things like that. The abstract freedoms of a liberal democracy were secondary to having food, to having bread and butter, to having a house.
I think one of the biggest lessons from the ICU it is the whole question of political mobilization in terms of the labor struggles.
What the ICU does, which was one of its major strengths, is that it organizes rurally. In a context both then and now where the land question is central to many, many African people. The ICU using that and using the militancy developed around that was able to organize rural people. And I think that can be a lesson not just for the left, but more importantly for our workers' organizations.
Another thing that's really attractive about them that speaks to the present is their internationalism. They had branches, they had supporters throughout Southern Africa. I think that's a really powerful antidote to xenophobia in the present.
It's sort of like an organization of migrant workers led by immigrants. So Clemens Kadali from Malawi, he's the main leader, he's really famous, but also like you've got the first assistant secretary is this guy called Peter Nyambo. He's also from Malawi. Clemens Kadali's brother, Robert Kadali, leads the ICU in Port Elizabeth at the end of the 1920s. And then Malawians sort of like lead the expansion of the ICU into Zimbabwe and into Malawi. So sort of like immigrant workers also from the Caribbean are really important to the ICU and sort of like the start of black trade unionism in Southern Africa.
One of the things we can learn from the ICU is this very expansive view of what trade unionism can be. I mean, we're in a situation now where unions tend to think politics means set up a political party. But the ICU was thinking about politics as something done by the union. So there wasn't a sort of outsourcing to a party. And its imagination was also one that didn't see the state as the repository of freedom. It was one which was actively aiming, whether through cooperatives or planned general strikes, to actually directly take over land and put it under worker self-management.
What marks the history of the ICU off from contemporary history is that we often look at working class politics from particular and often kind of crystallized and sectarian ideological perspectives. Whereas what the ICU history allows us to see is a kind of more fluid, less sectarian, more open production of working class politics.
Yeah, I think it's really
Let's stop
to sort of brings
there
in
for
lots
now.
of people from different political traditions, but they sort of work together.
Sorry, it's put off. Let's stop there for now. It's quite a long video, but I hope that gave some sort of, I mean, when I introduced the ICU, it was actually at that conference. And so it was my first dive into it. And that was a video kind of helping the audience, but also myself make sense of what is this huge organization. It's in the 1920s, it's a far off time, but also apparently the biggest black trade union of the time. So, I think this is a good segue into asking Henry to help us make sense of this time. Take us to that moment. Just a bit about Henry before we jump quickly to over Henry. So Henry is a historian of empire, labor and migration in the 20th century. His current research is focusing on African and Asian trade unions and the politics of free movement in the British Empire during the interwar period between World War I and II. He's currently researching, doing comparative study between the ICU and the All India Trade Union Congress, looking at how both trade unions championed socialist internationalism and challenged heightening worker repression and anti-immigrant restrictions in the 1920s and 1930s. I'm handing over to you, Henry.
Thanks, Mo. So yeah, thanks very much to Simani for hosting this event and Mo for organizing. So I'm going to talk through now just briefly about sort of the ICU, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union of Africa, and then how it engaged with the politics of migration in the 1920s. And here we've got a mass meeting of the ICU in Bloemfontein in 1926, where Clemens Skadali, the Malawi-born leader of the ICU, is addressing a mass meeting of workers. And I suppose there's three key points that I really wanted to sort of just emphasize and for you to take home from this presentation. So the first is that the South Africa's working class has always been transnational and multi-ethnic in origin. Second, black workers in South Africa from the 1920s have recognized that it's impossible to challenge capitalist interests, most notably the Chamber of Mines, without organizing across divisions of nationality, ethnicity, and gender since the 1920s. And then thirdly, sort of trying to like locate the origins of these anti-immigrant politics, divide and rule tactics. And really they come from two groups. Big capitalist employers like the Chamber of Mines really pushed this politics in the 1920s, but then also the white labor movement who push it from the late 1890s. So yeah, first of all, I'll just talk about the transnational nature of South Africa's working class, then look at the origins of immigration controls in South Africa, and then look at how the ICU responds, so how it pushes this idea of race consciousness, how it argues for freedom of movement, and then look at the role that anti-immigrant politics played in the fall of the trade union at the end of the 1920s. So from the start of the 20th century, you have a huge, very diverse working class in South Africa. You have Indian workers who come as indentured laborers from the mid 1900s. Chinese laborers are brought in to work on the Chamber of Mines at the start of the 20th century. And at the same time, you've got tens of thousands of Malawians coming to work on the Chamber of Mines, and also like half the workers on the mines are Mozambican in the mid 1920s. So South Africa's working class is inherently transnational in its nature. And I just wanted to focus in particular on Malawians, just as a case study and an example of like how important immigrant workers are to South Africa. So you've got a number of Malawian immigrants on the gold mines in Johannesburg. They're also on the copper mines in Messina and in farms. By the mid-1920s, you also have Malawians. They allegedly dominate the domestic service in Johannesburg, and they're very prominent as hotel workers. So they're very, very important economically. At the same time, you've got a number of political leaders in 1920s South Africa who are of Malawian origin. So Peter Nyambo, pictured here, he's president of the Cape Town ANC in the 1920s. And then George Kalinda, who the article on the right here talks about, he introduces the first branch of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association to Johannesburg in 1925. At the same time, you've got Malawians at the forefront of the trade unions in South Africa. So Clements Kadali, pictured in the middle here, he's the main leader of the ICU in the 1920s, but also his brother, Robert Kadali, pictured at the back there, he's the secretary of the Port Elizabeth ICU. So you've got a number of Malawians who are very prominent and at the forefront of the ICU. At the same time, Malawians are very important, like socially. So the Malawians within the ICU all organize balls at the ICU's Workers' Hall in Johannesburg. So alongside Kadali, you have Brown Banda and Stanley Highboy, who are noted dancers in the 1920s and 1930s. There's a famous Malawian musicians like J.G. Banda, who's from Kimberley. And you've got Rolf Stalomo writes about drinking and gambling Malawians in 1920 South Africa in Johannesburg in his novel An African Tragedy, which is the first main Black novel in the 1920s. At the same time, there are also a number of Malawian church leaders. So John George Phillips is a leader of the first major Pentecostal church in South Africa, the Christian Catholic Apostolic Church in Zion. Another Pentecostal church leader, J.R.A. Ankoma, leads the Apostolic Faith Church, and Johnson K. Mahamani leads the Presbyterian Church of South Africa in Johannesburg. So you've got a number of Malawians who are like very prominent in South African society, and more broadly, they have a huge impact and importance within South Africa by the 1920s. At the same time, however, you've got increasing prominence of anti-immigrant ideas globally. So the quote here is from the 1926 World Labour Conference on Migration, which is the first of its kind, and delegates there at this World Conference from Britain, Australia, India, and America, they resolved that migration can no longer continue on this like laissez-faire principle, and they call for this, what they call the socialist principle of direction and control to be applied. So basically for migration controls to be implemented. So then within South Africa, that sort of has a sort of particular resonance within white politics, and white politics is divided over the issue of migration. So Jan Smuts on the left here, he has this sort of quite broad, expansive vision of a broad British South Africa, which stretches into Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, and Namibia, and sort of like backing colonial business interests, like wants to see this as a zone of free movement. And then on the right here, you have James Herzog, who challenges Smuts on this. So during the elections, he says that Smuts will, quote, swamp white workers with Black immigrant workers if he comes to power. So you've got this sort of like contrasting politics of like what even South Africa is going to become, how far it's going to reach, but then also who can move and come to South Africa is central to white politics in the 1920s. In particular, this is pushed by the South African Labour Party and this guy here, Frederick Hugh Creswell. He comes to prominence in 1907 when he runs a successful campaign to ban Chinese workers from the gold mines. And he goes on to push for immigration restrictions in 1913, most notably the 1913 Immigration Regulation Act, which is used to ban Central and East African workers from South Africa. So I suppose like the 1913 Land Act is famous as this like really important moment where in the segregation of land in South Africa, but at the same time, you've got the segregation of the working class at this same moment, which then has profound impact on future generations. At the same time, like, this isn't sort of like a minority concern. So like even radicals at this time, most notably Bill Andrews, white radicals, who's the founding secretary of the Communist Party of South Africa, he's also calling for immigrant workers to be banned. So here he writes in 1925, you can't object to white immigrants in the same way as black immigrants. And the last sentence, one class will strengthen civilization in South Africa, the other will swamp it. So you have even like so-called white radicals thinking in very like white supremacist terms during the 1920s. At the same time, anti-immigrant politics also is prevalent within the Black trade union movement. So Henry Selby Umsamang, pictured here, he's a founding member of the ANC, and he initially works with Kadali at the start of the 1920s, but breaks away and he forms a rival trade union, but he calls for immigration restrictions himself. And he makes a clear demarcation between South African workers and then immigrant workers. And he says, he calls for immigration restrictions to be implemented and for all Malawians to be deported from South Africa. So it's not like just restricted to white labor politics, also anti-immigrant sentiment is prevalent within black worker politics from the 1920s. Umsamang writes these ideas in Untitled Chapter, which is owned by the Chamber of Mines. And you might think, okay, here there's a contradiction. Why would an organization which is entirely reliant on black immigrant workers pushing these anti-immigrant ideas? Well, in some ways that makes sense in terms of the Chamber of Mines wanting to restrict immigrant or the employment of immigrants to just the gold mines. So it wants to cut out competition with other businesses in other urban areas, so it doesn't have to pay as high wages. But then secondly, it also very much wants to undercut prominent organizations like the ICU, like the ANC, like the UNIA. And by dividing and ruling the black working class in South Africa, then it can gain more power. And this is part of its broader assault on the ICU, is this pushing of this these anti-immigrant politics. So I suppose, like, how does the ICU respond to this, and how does it organize around transnational labor during the 1920s? Well, a key aspect of this is this idea of like race consciousness, organizing all black workers, uniting them into one big union. And this is a quote from the ANC president, Pixley Seme, who says, "They fell upon this country like a mighty army. So Basotho leaders were drafted to Zululand, Zulus went to the Transvaal, and Xhosas worked with colored people all together in one big body." So I think it's important to highlight that, like, Clemens Kadali is one of a number of immigrant leaders within the ICU. So Peter Nyambo on the left here, he's also from Malawi. He's the first assistant secretary. Emmanuel Johnson, he's from West Africa. He's the junior vice president. James Gulam Gums, he's born in the Caribbean. He's the ICU's president between 1922 and 29. James Tiale is from Lesotho. Thabo Wilfred Kebomote is also from Lesotho, as are George and Mary Lenuno. So you've got a number of immigrant leaders who are incredibly prominent within the ICU, the most famous then being Clemens Kadali from Malawi. And I think this photo captures this sort of the way that, like, South African leaders work with immigrant leaders really nicely. So you've got 6 South African born leaders of the ICU standing at the back, but actually sitting at the front are 3 immigrant leaders. So James Gums from the Caribbean, Mote from Lesotho, and Kadali from Malawi. So it's not, immigrant leaders are at the forefront of what is the biggest black organization in 1920s South Africa. So the ICU rapidly rises. It's founded in 1919. By the mid-1920s, it's organizing huge rallies like this one in Bloemfontein, attracting thousands of people. Similarly, in Johannesburg, you've got a meeting of 5,000. This is in Market Square in central Johannesburg, and they're calling on workers to join the Great Campaign for Emancipation. So, like, what are the ideas that people get excited about, and why do people join the ICU? Well, the ICU calls for people to take up this idea of race consciousness, to wake up and become conscious of their race. And they call for Black workers to unite, African and coloured, Zulu, Xhosa, Pondo, Msoto, South Africans, Mozambicans, Malawians and Zimbabweans to all unite in one organisation under this sort of common Black working class identity. And the ICU's newspaper Workers' Herald questions, are you a race man? If so, join the ICU. And these ideas are partly influenced by Marcus Garvey. So James Tiale here is one of the leading Garveyites in South Africa, but then it also is sort of builds on local ideas about Black unity. See, these then are manifested in a number of forms. You have speeches, cartoons, essays, poems, and the cartoonist James Christie Scott draws a number of cartoons emphasizing calling on people to wake up. So when he awakes, when the Black working class awake, then the pillars of imperial capitalism and racial prejudice will collapse. So how then does this relate to migration politics? Well, the ICU argue that if workers want to challenge transnational capitalism, then they have to organize on a transnational basis. So you have to organize all workers, whether they're from Mozambique, whether they're from Malawi, whether they're from Zimbabwe, whether they're from South Africa, all in together in order to outflank the transnational migration system. Because if all workers aren't organized, then you can bring in scab labor from different locations and undercut striking workers very easily. So they explicitly organize on a transnational basis in order to fight the transnational migrant recruitment system. And they do this by explicitly challenging people like Msimang and Nkwana. So they say, why are you so blind and thoughtless that you can't see that we must unite, not just in South Africa, but across the whole of the African continent? And they really push this idea of the need to supply labor in a free market, so that they argue for free movement throughout the whole of Southern Africa. But at the same time, they are very conscious about the wage issue. So they do that. They call for maintained or increased wages through minimum wages. So they say, why should we restrict members of the working class in their movement or labor? Why not start from the other side by introducing a compulsory minimum wage? So they argue, rather than introducing immigration restrictions, which actually aren't that effective anyway, why not introduce controls over wages at a local and industrial level? And actually that's a far more effective mechanism for improving wages. So we don't need to control the borders, we just need to control wages at a local level. And that's how we raise wages, not by reducing immigration. I suppose, just as the Chamber of Mines takes a slightly complicated and contradictory approach, so in some ways so does the ICU. So it's not cut hard and fast that they support freedom of movement outright. So there's this question of how can they then reconcile the end of transnational recruitment and the maintenance of free movement. So, and they are divided over this issue. So Alex Makjabavu, who's the senior vice president pictured here, he does call for the deportation of all of Mozambican workers, and he says they should stay in Mozambique. At the same time, the ICU does criticize the customs of certain aliens to strip the country of its riches and carry them away to their alien homes. So I think there is this sort of complicated debates which play out within the ICU, and some people call for, they're agreed on the abolition of the Chamber of Mines recruitment system, but then at the same time they are divided about whether that then also means that freedom of movement needs to be maintained or not. This then all comes to a head at the end of the 1920s, where there's a number of anti-immigrant riots. So in Johannesburg in Christmas 1927, a number of people are killed in anti-Malawian riots, which erupt in the city. And after that, the Transvaal African Congress and Henry Selby Msimang call for all Malawians to be deported. The ICU then responds that actually you can't divide people like this, and that the Transvaal African Congress is only pushing this anti-immigrant rhetoric because it's trying to become more popular. It's not very popular at that time, but it's trying to just boost its popularity with these desperate calls. Nevertheless, anti-immigrant politics can then be attributed, at least in part, to the collapse of the ICU. The ICU fails for a number of reasons. It has a lot of financial problems. faces a lot of challenges, but anti-immigrant politics is definitely part of the mix. And Kadali himself assert that his rivals accused him of being a Malawian and therefore not fit to lead the South African working class. So in Durban in particular, Kadali is challenged. They're not prepared to be treated by a Nyasallander like you. We Zulus are gentlemen and we will not be interfered with by a man from Nyasaland. So there's certainly anti-immigrant politics, which are then like integral to the collapse of the ICU in the late 1920s. So just to then wrap up and recap. South Africa's working class has always been transnational and multi-ethnic in origin. Anti-immigrant ideas have been challenged by Black workers like Kadali and others since the 1920s, and then trying to then think about where these divide and rule tactics come from, both pushed by the white labour movement, but then also people writing on behalf of the Chamber of Mines. And I suppose it's also important just to finally reflect on like what freedom of movement means. So the Chamber of Mines pushes for one kind of freedom of movement, and then the ICU sort of like highlights the fact that you can't really call for freedom of movement without minimum wage controls at the same time. So yeah, I'll leave it there and hand over to Dinga.
Thanks, Henry. Comrade Dinga, are you okay with? Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. I'm ready, Mawia.
Okay, great. So just before, Comrade, in case anybody doesn't know you, I mean they should know you, but let me just introduce you as well. So obviously, it's Comrade Dinga. Besides being Chisimani's former co-director of programs, Comrade Dinga is a long-standing unionist and veteran political educator. I'm sure many of you have seen that viral clip of his when he speaks about political education and about the link between theory and experience. It's traveled all over the social media, and Dinga is now an influencer, basically. Comrade Dinga is a researcher for special projects based at NUMSA, National Union of Metal Workers Africa, at the head office in Johannesburg. But presently he is on sabbatical leave from the union and is a visiting research fellow at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. Comrade Dinga, go for it.
All right, thanks, Mo. Good day to everyone. Thanks, Henry, again for a rich account of the ICU. As I always say, the ICU in contemporary trade unions is hardly studied these days. It only appears on two occasions. It appears when, as a scarecrow to caution workers who want to organize beyond sectoral lines, and workers who do not focus and organize according to a specific industry. And the ICU gets wheeled in to say to these workers, if you organize beyond the industry lines, if you bring everyone into one big organizations, you will be like the ICU. And the ICU is treated as this amorphous organization that collapsed because it did not focus on industrial lines. The second time that we get to hear about the ICU is when there is some criticism within the unions of the South African Communist Party, and we get told that the ICU collapsed because it purged or excluded communists from its ranks. So it's quite useful to hear about the ICU and some of the perspectives that the organization held. And thanks for that, Henry. I've been asked to just briefly say why this discussion on the ICU in the 20s and its positions, perspectives on migrations may be important for the period that we are living in now. And as a trade unionist, I thought, let me just give you two anecdotes. I don't work in migration studies, and I thought, let me just talk about my recent experience, and maybe we could then talk about that. The first story I just want to tell you or share with you is about a course that I teach through the sociology department at VETS. And this is a course that brings together about 20 unionists every year. The second story I want to share is to talk about what I call the ongoing war since 2019 against truck drivers whose country of birth or origin is not South Africa. Many people have died, and a destruction to property and trucks has in the last 2 years has occurred in this country. Okay, let me start with the first one. As I said, I every year I teach a week-long course for South African trade unionists at Wits University. And these unionists are drawn from unions across federations. And one component of the course, which is on union renewal and revitalization, is to deal with the question of migration. How do unions organize cross-border migrant workers? And in the 5 years that I have taught this course, I've discovered a couple of things. Firstly, participants in the course, comrades in the course, make little distinction between different types of migrants, between a documented worker with a contract and undocumented workers, between migrant workers and refugees and asylum seekers. Now, this lack of differentiation leads to an unsympathetic understanding of the conditions of cross-border migrants. The second discovery that I have made through being part of the course is that today's unionists, not only are they not aware, Henry, about the ICU, but even the recent history of the labor movement in South Africa and the contribution in the building of contemporary unions by migrant worker leaders is not known. So I have to spend some time explaining how the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, had a big component of migrant workers at the beginning in the late 70s and early 80s. And when I tell people that the president of the NUM, founding president James Motlatsi, was a Lesotho citizen when he joined the union, people are surprised. I give other example of Jack Charles Bezerino to NUMSA and how these cross-border migrants from Lesotho built unions. So it's not people like Kadali that are not known, but even some of the contribution of recent leaders in building the union movement is unknown. The third discovery is that almost all the unions, and I say across federation, there are no coherent strategies about organizing cross-border migrant workers. And when we have this discussion in class, there is a resistance to any organizing of migrant workers as migrant workers. There is a push of adopting a universalist approach that these are workers and they should just be organized as workers. And the last thing that I wanted to share about my experience is that whilst the unions that are known and are active in South Africa are trying to figure out what to do with migrant workers in terms of organization, migrant workers in various forms are busy with self-organization. And in that, in the last few years, there's been the formation of a union called the Migrant Workers Union of South Africa, MEWUSA, which is a small union, but it started as a union of Zimbabwean workers who work in South Africa. There are a lot of other informal organizations that are based on countries of origins and that perform a support networks for these workers around Johannesburg. And we have sort of invited a speaker from MEWUSA to come and address the participants in the course. Now, these discoveries are quite serious for me if one considers that in 2017, 2 million cross-border migrants of working age were in South Africa, and this represents about 5.3 of South Africa's labor force. So just about 5 out of 100 people of working age in this country were born outside of South Africa. And if we break down these figures further, we will find out that migrants are found in more precarious and low-paying sectors, employed as gardeners, as domestic workers, as farm workers. They are also found in the informal sector. So, from this anecdotal explanation, it's clear to me that today we are very far from where the ICU was in the 20s, where at least there was a strategy and an attempt to organize actively cross-border migrants. The second thing that I wanted to share with participants in this webinar is what's going on in presently in South Africa, which is the war against what I'll call non-local truck drivers. And although this has erupted over time, since 2019, we've seen an explosion of this war. And it started when a strike by truck drivers took place, and many trucks were destroyed in the course of that strike. And I just wanted to share with you the responses of the major unions in the transport sector. I mean, referring to the strike by the truck drivers, the General Secretary of the Democratic Transport and Allied Workers Union, DITAU, Comrade Vusin Changase, described the action of the truck drivers as, I quote, an attempt to send a message to the government and the private sector that local truck drivers should be prioritized over foreign nationals. Though we condemn the lawlessness, we support the call as a matter of principle. The union did go to condemn employers who pay what they call non-local drivers less than the South African. DITAU called for the imposition of quotas to regulate the employment of foreign nationals. It called for the government to aggressively enforce the quotas by levying stiff penalties against employers who employ illegal foreign nationals. The majority union, which is an affiliate of COSATU, which is the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union, SATAU, issued a statement stating that it is opposed to the employment of non-locals. The union said, South African legislation is clear. A company cannot employ a foreign national unless she possesses a scarce skill. Possessing a Code 14 driver's license, however, is hardly a scarce skill. This is what SATAU said in reaction to what was happening in 2019. Now, when I look at the responses of these unions, I want to ask, how different is the response of unions today to the close national labor market policy advanced by Selby Msimang in the 20s against the policy of the ICU? And I think that it's important for us who are involved in the union movement to reflect on the policies on migrations and the actions of our unions on the issue. Just to conclude, Mo, I've shared these two anecdotes. They are taken from the union movement, but I think that it will be important for people who work in other sectors, who are organizing in other spheres, to look at those spheres and the organizing in those spheres and ask questions about what the social movements, the progressive movements in this country are doing on the issue of migration, and to also say what lessons can we learn from the history of the ICU. I don't believe that answers are found only in the past. The 20s in the 20th century and the 20s in the 21st century may have differences, but I think that there is a lot that we can learn from an organization like the ICU. Let me leave it at that, Mo, and we can maybe have some discussion when there's question and answers.
Thanks, Comrade Dinga, and also Henry. I mean, so just before we get into some of the questions, I just have some I suppose, clarity questions as somebody who is not in a union or hasn't been in a union, also somebody who is not a scholar of history. So I mean, it was mentioned by Henry, but also I suppose touched on by you in one of your anecdotes about this thing of trying to organize in a non-sectoral way, and also this distinction between the ICU as a general union as opposed to an industrial union. Can either Henry or Comrade Dinga assist us in understanding what are these differences in union organizing? Henry, you mentioned the difference between a general and an industrial union. Could you maybe start with that one?
Yeah. So, I mean, general unions emerged in the late 1890s as an idea. And they basically, as a response to the undercutting of strike action in Britain and in America. And then it's very quickly introduced in South Africa as well. And there's this idea of like the one big union, which is pushed by syndicalists. And it's basically saying that you can't organize effectively unless you organize all workers into one big union. And I suppose like a limited industrial unions, which are just focused on individual sectors. If you don't organize everyone, or if you don't organize like unemployed or unskilled or immigrant workers, then they can simply be brought in and to undermine and break strikes. So yeah, this idea from the 1890s is pushed that we need to like organize all workers into one big union or into general unions in order to then achieve successful strike action. So yeah, so this moving from just organizing skilled workers to also organizing unskilled workers, and that's key to then successful strikes, such as you've got like the London dock strike of 1889.
Okay, thanks. Comrade Dinga, is this similar to what you were saying? The people get warned of as a kind of if you try and organize in a different way to this, look what happened to the ICU. Is this referring to the same concept?
Yes, Mo, it's the same issue. And as Henry said, basically a general union organizes all people, regardless of the sector in which they're coming from or they're working in. General unions also historically have sort of organized people who like unemployed into the union. So it gets a sort of a mass character, whereas an industrial union is more of a sectoral union. It's the metal workers union, it's the food workers union, it's the public sector union, and this debate has been with us in South Africa since the birth of trade unionism. Not only was it there in the 20s, it resurfaced in the 40s, and those who were in the early 80s, this was the divide between what were the FOSATU unions, the Federated of South African Trade Unions affiliates, which emphasized industrial and sectoral organizing, and the unions that were in the United Democratic Front or affiliated to the UDF, such as the South African Allied and Workers Union. So in many of the FOSATU education activities, the ICU was in the main brought in to show that if you organize generally and bring in everyone, you're not going to be strategic, you're not going to be attacking priority sectors in the economy, you will be like the ICU. So when we got into the union, many workshops were run on the demise of the ICU. But clearly, it was just a selective use of the ICU history.
Okay, thanks so much. And then the second framing question I have before we open up to the rest is, I mean, something that struck out to me quite powerfully was from Henry's presentation about this idea that if capitalism or capital is transnational, then you need to be organizing transnationally. And Comrade Dinga, from your presentation, you said that, you know, this idea of the idea of organizing workers across borders doesn't really have much purchase in the current context. When did this idea if this idea doesn't have purchase now, at what points did it lose purchase? Was it back when the ICU failed? Is it attributed to that moment, or have there been attempts for transnational organizing in South Africa, at least, that are notable that we can refer to as well?
Dingo, do you want to answer that first?
Okay. Let me try. I mean, as I said, the South African capitalism brought people from different parts of Southern Africa. The mining industry was built on sort of a migrant labor system, which had an internal component to that, but it also brought people from the neighboring countries, and so a big component of people who were workers were people who came from countries across the border. So when the union movement was emerging in the 70s and in the 80s, there were still large sections of people who came from Mozambique and who worked on the mines, and who came from Lesotho. So it is for that reason that if you look at the history of the NUM, some of the leaders were sort of came from Lesotho and became the presidents of the union. Someone who came from Lesotho became the deputy president of NUMSA. But what happened, if one looks at the stats, is that that contract system of bringing in people from outside of South Africa began to diminish. And by when we start with 1990, and by the time the ANC government comes in, that system of the sort of migrant labor from the neighboring is as a sort of an official migration policy is disintegrates. Partly, and maybe Henry can say, partly because also of the demands of the unions for some of the people who have worked for many of these years in South Africa to be given South African citizenship in South Africa. So there is a demise of that bringing in of cross-border migrants into that. So I think what happened is that with the distinction formally within the unions disappearing, also attempts to organize these workers is not there. I'm just to give you, for instance, when we discuss it with the unionists, people always insist that a worker is a worker, and we don't ask where you come from. And we may see whether this worker is from Mozambique when they give us their ID for union membership and dues. But besides that, there isn't a distinction. But these are people who may have the papers, the documents. The undocumented is another story to organize. Henry, let me give it to you.
I suppose just to complement what Dingo's saying, at certain points you've got very high percentages of the gold mining sector its workforce is made up of immigrant labourers. So like in the 1920s, it's over 50% of all workers on the gold mines are from Mozambique. And then similarly in the 1970s, over half the mine workforce, I think, is immigrant workers, predominantly from Lesotho and then also from Mozambique. So I suppose, yeah, in those instances, then you can't really organize effectively if you're not organizing immigrant workers. There's no way that, and the ICU tries to like challenge the Chamber of Mines. I mean, ultimately the ICU is defeated on the gold mines because the mine compounds are very effective at locking the ICU out of the gold mines. So ICU organizers are banned from going onto the gold mines. Any mine worker or mine clerk who works for the ICU is sacked from the Chamber of Mines. So the gold mines are very effective at organizing against the ICU, but then at the same time, the ICU does explicitly target the gold mines as the key sector in the South African economy, which I think, yeah, is significant, especially in the 1920s when you haven't got much industrialization beyond the gold mines. So that is like the key driver of the South African economy in the 1920s, and then later you have industrial development, which then makes industrial unions a bit more viable. So there's a lot of it then depends on the underlying economy of South Africa at the time. What is a more effective organizing strategy? So in the 1920s, arguably, and then in the 1970s again, arguably general unions and 80s, general unions become more effective. And arguably today, like you've got a resurgence of general trade unionism today. So like the the Federation of South African Trade Unions is now beginning to say, okay, we need to organize on a general union basis again and organize along supply lines in order to effectively challenge employers. So I think a lot of it depends on the underlying economy of South Africa.
Okay, thanks, comrades. That was a very, very elaborate answer. Okay, I see that Comrade Tempele has written something in the comments, but I don't think it's complete. Comrade Tempele, do you wanna speak over the mic? Can I allow you to talk? Raise your hand if you want to. Okay, I think he's okay. There we go. So, Comrade Tempele, you can speak. Unmute. Yeah. Comrade Tempele, you just have to unmute.
Hi, comrade.
Hi, comrade, we can hear you. Go ahead.
All right, thanks. For what the comrades have been raising around the issues of migration, labor coming, either going outside South Africa or coming in South Africa, I think the problem is around as to how trade unions, firstly, are a reactionary force by themselves, and therefore they always react to a particular agenda, which sometimes it becomes difficult in terms of their structural approach to be able to overcome the challenges that they meet when they face capitalism, because it sometimes works within themselves. So the old model of the ICU and the present models of general workers' unions, I think to me that they don't serve the purpose of actually establishing a trade union movement as a fighting movement for workers.
Thanks, Comrade Tempele. I have another hand here from Jerry Nkosi. Jerry, you can unmute and speak.
Thank you, Comrade Mo, and thank for the presentation from the two comrades. It was very enriching and enlightening. I just want to just a question here. I have heard some countries mentioned in terms of the migrant workers, but I've never heard the mentioning of workers from Swaziland, workers from Botswana. Is there a specific reason why those workers from those countries might not have, maybe in their numbers, they might be there and there, but maybe in their numbers? And also, I think the issue of unions being led by non-South Africans, I think Comrade Dinga mentioned a number of people, but also if we remember people like Comrade Chris Dlamini, he was from, in fact, originally from Swaziland. Comrade Stomo Dlamini, in fact, originally he is from Swaziland, though as Comrade Dinga was saying, that the demand that we're forcing people to get South African citizens. But also just a thinking, given the situation of today, because I'm thinking that at that time, the 1920s, the ICU, there were not as many unions as we have today. And given the situation where we are today, is it which better way can we follow? Is it industrial unions or is it general unions? Thank you.
So, guys, I'm not sure if that's a general question to all of us or kind of particularly to the panelists. I think maybe we'll allow them to close on that later. But for now, let's take the particular questions. I mean, there's one in the comment section here, which asks, in the gig worker economy, which has many immigrant and migrant workers, do you think there's more possibility of organizing as gig workers regardless of nationality? And maybe just start off the response to Comrade Dinga and Henry with what a gig worker is.
Gig worker.
And then before we get answers, let's just take Abongile and then you can just answer as a round. Abongile, you can unmute and speak.
Hello, how are you? No, it's Melikaya here. Okay. No, I wanted to know that, like, as you know, that there's a nationalism where you will find that the citizens of the country, they will fight for the sovereignty of their countries. Like they say, no, like for instance, Comrade Dinga mentioned that at some point, even the union themselves, they were saying that I think there was a conflict between truck drivers. So the South African, they were saying that, we want to defend the rights of the South African. At the same time, how do you balance with that and the unionism? For instance, we are saying that the union must be able to organize cross borders, irrespective of which countries they are coming from. So I would like to know how can you balance those two and tie it as a one? Because I find it, for instance, as you know, the capitalism, they always try to maximize profit, and then they will employ foreign nationals at the cost of the country or of the citizen of that particular country. For instance, in our case, the South Africa. So how do you balance those two without even causing conflict among the citizens? Where, as you know, that for instance, in our restaurant, we'll find that there are especially here in Cape Town, in Waterfront, we've been told that it's predominated by the foreign nationals. The restaurant, they are no longer taking South African because South African are very expensive. You see. So how do you balance it? And then in revolt, the South African, they say, no, these people are taking our job, you see. And then it's difficult even the union to mobilize around that. So that's my question.
Okay. There's some more questions, but let's hold there for a minute and allow the panelists to respond. I mean, you can respond freely, but maybe let's start with Comrade Dinga. Comrade Dinga, the answers you want to, or the questions you want to respond to?
All right. Moa got kicked out, but then I came back, so I may have missed some of the questions. I see there is a question from a comment from Facebook. It's not a question, by Comrade Anthony, the chairperson of the Communist Party in the Western Cape. So he wants to know about the expulsion of the communists and that. And Henry, I'll leave that to you. But Comrade Anthony, the other question about SATAU and its recent leadership, being the General Secretary and being Zimbabwean. Let me make a general point without getting into, yes, Comrade Anthony and Comrade Jerry, we've had some leaders in the present unions who come from across the border. I think the SATAU thing is complicated because it got revealed the person was not documented, and that the people in the union didn't know that, and they used that to get him out. So some of the politics of xenophobic politics sometimes would sort of emerge. I think there was a point about what unions can do, and I think it's Comrade Tempele who's saying that the unions are reactionary. That's now that they respond. I think that's how he's using reactionary. My view is that trade unions have shown to be creative organizations. And if we take this question of migration, what has emerged in union movements in other parts of the world is a definite attempts to organize migrant workers. And there are different examples where the unions decide to establish what they call parallel structures for migrant workers, because not only are their conditions different, there are sometimes questions of language, there are vulnerabilities. So some of the union movements have found it appropriate to establish what they call parallel structures, where they organize these migrants so that they have a space where they can deal with their problems under the broad umbrella of the union. And the debate within the union movement is, do you adopt the parallel approach, or do you adopt what is called the universalist approach in organizing migrants? And I think these are some of the discussions that are happening somewhere. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, this debate about how to organize migrants hasn't moved in South Africa beyond resolutions to do so. Hasn't moved beyond resolutions, and which is why we're finding self-organizing taking place amongst cross-border migrants. Henry, you can take some of them. I can come back to others. Yeah.
Henry, maybe start with the last one about the why the ICU expelled the Communist Party.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is quite complicated and contentious even today, I suppose. I mean, it's still invoked, like Blade and Zamande invoked this like 2 years ago. During the AMCU split, saying like you don't want to become Kadaliites, and accused AMCU of Kadaliitis. So there's a long history of like politicking and politics around the ICU and the communists, which is still like carrying on today. I mean, I suppose like fundamentally, I think one thing to appreciate, like lots of people like to write about like the radicals within the ICU, like people like James Laguma and Thomas Mbeki and Clemens Kadali. But there is then this like quite well-established moderate core to the ICU, like a big moderate faction which often win debates and is explicitly anti-communist. So I suppose there's no point in like shying away from that factor within the ICU, and there are lots of moderate leaders and moderate members of the ICU. At the same time, James Laguma, and I think, yeah, lots of people have like framed it as liberals gaining increasing influence within the ICU, whereas actually there is then this like well-established moderate influence within the ICU, and then people like Henry Selby Umsamang influencing from the outside. That there is then this like within the Black trade union movement, there is a moderate influence. At the same time, like James Laguma like doesn't really make any friends in the course of 1926. So he writes a report criticizing all his comrades for financial indiscretions, which aren't like entirely unfounded. So like Kadali and Alexander Maduna are spending lots of money on frivolous things like the Workers' Hall and the Workers' Herald. So it's very basically, it comes to a big spat, and John Gomez says basically it was a personality split between Laguma on the one hand and Clemens Kadali on the other, and Laguma wasn't as popular as Kadali. So I suppose that's one way of reading it. I think then there is also then this important global context where you have actually internationally, there's a massive increasing split between socialists and communists throughout the world. So in the Indian trade union movement, there's a big split between the communists and the socialists in 1928. In Britain, there's a big split between the communists and the socialists in 1927. So I think this is like part of this unfolding tension, whereas socialists and communists are working together in the early mid-1920s at a global level. And then at the end of the 1920s, there's increasing antagonism between socialists and communists. And you have communists talking in terms of socialists as social fascists. And then, yeah, I suppose partly it's like disagreements over whether you want to pursue change through reformist constitutional methods or revolutionary methods. And that splits the left. I suppose, yeah, one thing which is interesting about the ICU and then lots of other movements at this time is that you have lots of different political traditions working together. So you have syndicalists working with communists, working with socialists, working with moderates in the ICU. And then that sort of isn't like so popular or prominent from the 1930s onwards. In terms of like Swaziland, the ICU does try to organize a bit in Swaziland. And there's a guy called Norman Nkumalo, who is involved with ICU organizing in Swaziland. So that there is a bit of ICU organizing in Swaziland. And then I suppose, yeah, is the ICU reactionary? Like, I suppose that ties into my earlier point. Like there is like this moderate, like pro-British constitutional element within the ICU. And certainly like it invokes like British ideals of freedom of movement and free speech and free organization and British justice at various points, which undoubtedly is reactionary and in many ways pro-imperial. But I suppose at the same time, you do have then these sort of quite utopian, but also like aspirational aspects. So it does call for the abolition of capitalism and the idea of this socialist commonwealth. It forms cooperatives in Durban. It establishes a number of autonomous factories. It tries to buy a number of farms. So I suppose there is this aspiration in many ways to transcend capitalism in South Africa. So I suppose, yeah, there's lots of components within the ICU and yeah, different voices at different times.
Thanks, Henry. The one that was missed, I believe, was Abongile's one. I think he might have been cut off at the time, Dinga. He basically was, are you frozen, Comrade Dinga? Or are you just very still? Comrade Dinga, can you hear us? He might have been cut off. Okay. I think when Comrade Dinga comes back, we'll reframe the question from Abangile again. But I see that we also have a comment from Pindile, who says that Dinga Sukwebu makes an important point. Here is an extract from the Casual Workers Advice Office. And the extract reads, To date, the organized labor movement has shown little or no appetite to organize difficult to organize workers. A survey of COSATU revealed that 92% of the Federation's membership is made up of permanent workers, and that over 60% are white collar. The Federation is moving in an opposite direction to its blue collar roots. Such precarious workers it has organized are being organized purely as protection for its permanent members. In other words, there is as yet no indication that the established labor movement is willing to organize precarious workers and take the issues affecting them. Then Pindi goes on to say, they go on to show how even though the construction sector has many migrant workers, none of the established unions have made real efforts to organize these workers or address specific issues they face as precarious labor. Comrade Dinga, I see you connecting again.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just read Pindi's comment about COSATU's inability or lack of desire to organize precarious workers. And I just wanted to bring your attention to something Abongile asked earlier, essentially about trying to balance kind of nationalist or I suppose you might call them patriotic desires to protect individuals who come from your own country with this. How do you balance that with the kind of labor sectors and capitalism's the nature of migrant capitalism? So how do you as a nationalist, or how can you balance this nationalist kind of fervor of wanting to protect the sovereignty of your country and ensure jobs for people who actually live here with the reality of migrant labor and like migrancy, basically migrant capitalism? Comment Abangile, I'm not sure if I represented you accurately there, but that's what I understood. If I haven't, please let me know in the comments and we can adjust that. But that was the question from Abangile. And then a second, the comment or question from India again. In March, the Labour and Employment Minister, Tulas Nelson, made an announcement that his debt will be pushing for a policy, or his department, sorry, will be pushing for a policy that limits the hiring of immigrant workers in low-skilled jobs in hospitality, retail, security, and farming. This is framed as a response that protects citizens against workers from other countries and a way to address the unemployment crisis, especially among the youth. The unions haven't said much on this. Please comment on this. And I suppose the themes of this question are very similar to what Comrade Abangile was asking about protecting individuals who are from here and how to respond to kind of the national nature of migrant, the transnational nature of capitalism. Anyone want to take a first stab at this? Comrade Dinga, before you cut off again, go for it.
Yeah, it's getting to those difficult questions, but let's try. And as I always say, I mean, I'm looking at the people who
Dinga has been cut off again. Yeah, connectivity is not a friend of ours either. Okay. Henry, while Comrade Dinga is obviously cut off, do you feel in any way placed to respond to any of these?
I suppose, yeah, I mean, I suppose just drawing on what I've already said in the presentation, I suppose like a lot of like this idea of who is South African and who is not South African is something that then plays out or like emerges in the 1920s. So in the 1921, or yeah, I think it's the 1921 census, then over 90% of people put themselves as British. And then by the 1936 census, like over 90% of people put themselves as South African. So there's this massive shift from a sort of an imperial British identity to then this South African identity. which is to say that like actually like an idea of South Africanness which emerges in the 1920s is constructed and like develops according to certain interests at that time. And I suppose what the ICU reacts against that by saying, well, actually we shouldn't be thinking in terms of South Africans and non-South Africans, we should be thinking in terms of bosses and workers. And that we should be thinking in terms of Africa as a whole, and rather than just in terms of a South African, the South African state. So I suppose that that could go some way to sort of like this idea that workers can think if they think in terms of their working class identity rather than their South African identity. And actually, in many ways, the South African identity is instrumentalized to try and undermine working class organization and power.
So, Henry, if I understand you correctly, I mean, what you're saying is that the idea of nationalism in terms of being South African was constructed at a certain point in time. And that, I mean, what the ICU was saying is that, you know, like the nationalist understanding of nation states is one framework, but not necessarily one that they agreed with. Thinking about terms in terms of like being a worker or being a boss, or thinking about I suppose, Pan-Africanist idea of being African was more of a focus there, I suppose. So I hear what you're saying. Comrade Dinga has been cut off, so I'm not sure he can respond to any of the other questions. But I see just a comment. I don't think it's a question, again, from Anthony. Comment Dinga also is trying to connect right now. Okay, but the comment from Anthony is the take-up of migrant workers in the agricultural sector continue to be a flashpoint. Workers in this sector accuse employers of using migrant workers to undercut and avoid paying the sectorial minimum wage. 2012 farm workers strike in Western Cape, however, saw the solidarity amongst local and migrant workers. So Comrade Anthony is saying that there has actually been some degree of, you know, cross-border or local and migrant worker unification, at least in the Western Cape. So I'm not sure. Okay, I think we're almost out of time. It's about 5 minutes left. Henry, I think we're going to ask for you to close, and then hopefully by the time you're done, Comrade Ding will be back so he can close as well. Okay.
Thanks, Mo. I suppose, getting on to these tricky questions about industrial organization or industrial unions versus general unions. I mean, I suppose it's been quite, you have like big set camps which have been in existence at various stages, and it gets quite political and quite, very political. And I suppose, you have people who are on team general unions versus people who are on team industrial unions. I suppose I think I would want to sort of think in terms of like, actually certain unions are more powerful and more effective at different moments in time and according to different conditions. And I think to say, like, just to give like a blanket dismissal of general unions is dangerous, and does allow weaknesses to emerge within working class organizations, just as the flip side is also accurate. To completely dismiss industrial unions would also be flippant. And I suppose there has been a danger within the labor movement in South Africa to sort of like doggedly side with one mode of organizing workers at one moment in time, when actually often you need to think creatively and look at the context in the whole. And in certain moments, different kinds of organization are relevant. I suppose, like today, we've got increasing precarity within the workforce, and at that point, actually general trade unions are maybe increasingly relevant within South Africa today.
And I think you ended at the perfect point, because I see Comrade Dinga is connecting to audio again, so we can. So Comrade Dinga, I sorry you got cut off there. What I'd like you to do is maybe answer that difficult question that you were talking about, and then perhaps close. It might actually be a good way to end. And just a reminder, it's a question about the kind of organizing difficult workers, why they haven't said much, but also relating it to this kind of question of like nationalism versus this, the nature of transnational capitalism. How do you reconcile those two things? Can you not hear us? Oh, you can't hear. Okay. Give me a second. Wait. No, wait. Make your closing statement, comment, Dinga, and relating it to basically the reconciling of transnational capitalism and nationalism, but also this question of why unions aren't responding to the difficulty in organizing precarious labor. Sorry about that. Dinga's having sound issues, so I just sent him a WhatsApp voice note. Reconciling of transnational capitalism and nationalism, but also this question of why unions aren't responding to the difficulty in organizing precarious labor.
All right. Sorry, comrades. There's some mishap. I can't hear, but I believe you can hear me. Just quickly to Abungile's question, and then I'll just make my closing point. Look, when in the 90s, the COSATU framework on migration emphasized that you cannot have what they called a rational and progressive migration policy without a regional development strategy. So we cannot think that we can develop South Africa alone in the region without an industrial and development strategy for the region. If we don't pursue that industrial policy, then people will follow capital, and then they will come to South Africa. So it is in the interest of the working class in South Africa and the working class in the region for that regional development strategy. I think it's been the difficulty of pursuing that we are finding ourselves in this position. I can also say that probably it's easier said in a resolution than being done in practice. To say just to what Pindi said, yes, there's been a lot of policies on migration, and generally the unions are quiet, whether it's the Border Management Act, it's some of the pronouncement that Pindi referred to. I think that retreat from a regionalist sort of a perspective has made it difficult for labor to respond in progressive ways. But I would like also to, we've been talking about what labor is doing or not doing, but it will be interesting for me to hear what other sectors, because the students are not just in South Africa. The students from Zimbabwe, they come to Wits, they come to all these other universities. And I would want to hear what is an internationalist student perspective, social movements, where they organize in communities where there are also these cross-border migrants, and what is an approach to that. And I'm hoping that maybe through this series that Chisimane has initiated, we can then move to other sectors because it's through that we can then, as a South African left and progressive, develop a position. I know that there was an issue that Comrade Jerry raised about unions and which best way, but Comrade Jerry, we can catch up as a unionist here in Joburg and discuss that question so that we don't go into extra time.
Thank you, Comrade Dinga, and also thank you, Henry, both of you, for this fascinating discussion. I mean, I mentioned this before, but I learned about the ICU and got involved in learning about this only in 2019, and I've been fascinated by it since, and not as somebody who's generally a fan of history. So I always find these engagements very fruitful, and I'm just kind of left with this very powerful notes that came out of the slides about the idea of, if the issue is transnational, then you need to organize transnationally. I think that's quite a powerful sentiment. And moving off of what Comrade Dinga just left us, I'm just going to discuss a bit about the final episode on this border and migration series. It's going to be discussing this book, and the book is called Border and Rule: Global Migration, Capitalism, and Racist Nationalism. Quite a powerful title, and it even sounds like it's should be a title in our series. It's taking place on the 4th of May, again at 4 o'clock. 4th of May is a Tuesday. This extends our series internationally, in which author Harsha Walia perhaps disrupts easy explanations for the migrant and refugee crisis, instead showing them to be the inevitable outcomes of conquest, capitalist globalization, and climate change generating mass dispossession worldwide. It's quite an interesting perspective on what drives migrancy and refugee crisis around the world. And again, that's going to be on the 4th of May. On behalf of Chisimani Center for Activist Organization, I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon and for following this series. This will be uploaded onto the Chisimani page, so if you missed bits or want to share it with others, you'll find it on our social media, but it'll be linked to our website as well. Thank you, Henry Dinga, once again, and thank you, audience. See you again in about 2 weeks. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Mo.